Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Discovery Debrief, a podcast that dives headfirst into the proverbial deep end of the latest trek into the final frontier, Star Trek Discovery. I'm co-host Chris Clow, and I'm joined by our bold panel of Star Trek franchise explorers, including Rachael Clow.
Hello.
Zaki Hasan.
Hi.
And Cicero Holmes.
Don't kill Mock, damn it. Oh, is it Mog?
You mean
Nog?
Nog?
Yeah, Nog.
You mean Nog.
Yeah.
Well, inside joke. Well, not that inside, but inside enough, because that is actually going to be the topic of our discussion today. So last time we all got together, it was to say goodbye to season 2 of Star Trek Discovery, and we're not going to be seeing that show again for a while. It's going to be in a radically different status quo. We're not done talking about Discovery season 2. But we're tabling it for now because we all just saw a movie last night that kind of revives in our minds conversations surrounding what could arguably be referred to as the greatest Star Trek series, Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So we all went to the Fathom Events screening in our respective locations for What We Left Behind, looking back at Star Trek Deep Space Nine, directed by Ira Stephen Bear, and I think David Zappone, and partially too by Adam Nimoy. And we're going to talk about it for you guys. But before we get into that, as usual, let's check in with our panelists to see what everybody's been up to since the last time we got together. Cicero, what about you, man? Start us off.
It's, you know what? So What We Left Behind made me both feel joy and shame and hope. Joy, shame, and hope. So the joy was the celebration of Deep Space Nine. The shame was that I did not begin already my broadcast reverse order rewatch of Star Trek, which right now stands at Deep Space Nine. Mm-hmm. And the hope is that I will get to it soon. Okay, very good. And what else you been up to besides the absorption of the film? So, still I saw Endgame for the third time, this time in IMAX.
Ooh.
If you have not seen it in IMAX, that is, not only is IMAX mostly always the definitive way to see a film, but this film was filmed in IMAX and it looks spectacular. And that's really not hyperbole. It really immediately, you could tell that this film was made for IMAX. So, if you've only seen it once, do yourself a favor and go see it in IMAX. In fact, if you have not seen it in IMAX, just go see it in IMAX. They need your help. This movie's not doing well.
This fledgling film,
right?
This tiny indie.
Yes. So the other thing that I am up to right now is I am on the cusp of traveling off to Los Angeles to participate in Wizards of the Coast D&D Live, The Descent. D&D Live 2019, The Descent. It is a weekend-long celebration of all things Dungeons and Dragons, and they have brought in a few of the let's see, I guess what do we call live action? Well, we're not LARPers. It's like tabletop streamers and game players of Dungeons and Dragons across their landscape. And my group, my ensemble, the Rivals of Waterdeep, will be there and will be performing on Saturday. So stay tuned. Check out Rivals Waterdeep on Twitter, and you can find out the wheres and the whens. And if you're in the Los Angeles area and happen to be at D&D Live, please let me know so we can take some pictures and exchange hugs and stuff.
Very cool. Good to know. Rachael, what have you been up to?
Oh, I have been deeply confused and saddened by Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been disappointed in the current season, which I don't know why, because I knew it was going to be disappointing, and there's no way that they could really end it in a satisfactory way because there's just so much going on. And Weiss and Benioff are not George R.R. Martin.
Right. But weren't they acting off of his marching orders, like in guiding the show? Supposedly,
yes. Like they are acting off of bullet points.
Yes.
The ways in which and so I can kind of see where the bullet points are. But the ways in which they're sort of getting to those bullet points don't really make a ton of sense to me. The pacing is really fast, and it's just, not really satisfying in any way, especially because I don't think we're ever going to really see George R.R. Martin's ending.
Right, yeah, he's going to be dead before.
Yeah, so it's sad all around, I think.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Well, I think that if we did wind up seeing George's vision of the end of his series, that would also be sad. And somewhat less than satisfying for your own hopes and desires for how things should end.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot of like plot points that I am super like I hold super dear, and I really want them to be covered. Like so in that respect, that's not something that bothers me. It's sort of certainly the execution on the show has not been satisfactory for me.
Yeah. Why are there only 6 episodes this season? I mean, that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, kind of.
Well, I've never really been a fan of the show, so I can't really say I feel your pain.
Yeah,
but
I got
empathize.
this guy over here. He's like those 2 Muppets that like just talk shit during the
Statler.
Yeah, it just sort of like, well, why is he doing that? Like, that's Chris during Game of Thrones.
Why are all those horse guys running off into the darkness?
Yeah, well,
they're not going to die.
That's pretty much Chris.
That's a conversation for another time, I think. Zaki, what have you been up to, man?
Well, just mere moments before logging on to talk to you, I watched All Good Things, continuing my chronological Trek rewatch. It had been a bit, it had been a minute, but after Discovery's finale, my oldest was like, "Hey, can we get back to Next Generation and finish it?" So I was like, absolutely. So I truthfully, I haven't watched that episode since it first aired 25 years ago.
Oh, wow. So you got to see it in high definition for the first time then.
First time in high definition. And it is almost exactly 25 years since it aired. So it's and the plot of the episode is Picard leaping, 25 years ahead. And so that's something sort of, it's weird. It's weird to now be here 25 years later. And, I was a freshman in high school. It was the end of my freshman year. And then here I am now with, watching it with 3 boys who are just as into Star Trek. I mean, what a crazy world,
Yeah, no kidding. When Rachel was going through TNG entirely for the first time, because she had seen it, I think she had seen the series finale before, but when you watched it you didn't remember much of it. And I remember when we were sitting on the couch at your parents' house.
I had seen it in a way that my dad had watched it and I was in the room.
Okay.
There you go.
But I remember sitting on your parents' couch, and I told you what the last word was spoken in the episode. And you didn't really know what to make of it. And then as soon as he said it, your eyes just welled up with tears. I will never forget that. It was just, but I mean, there are a few episodes in existence that can affect me on such an emotional level as All Good Things. It's certainly one of my favorite TV episodes ever, and it might even be my favorite finale ever for any show that I've watched.
Talk about satisfying things, the satisfying endings.
At the risk of tipping our hand for this episode, I think Deep Space Nine edges out All Good Things for me as far as being an emotional Star Trek finale.
A very reasonable perspective to have, and it's also one that I might share if I Well, we'll get into it, but but I mean, yeah, it's a very, very good finale episode. I mean, considering how they were kind of ratcheting it up until the very end of Deep Space Nine's run, is still a phenomenal show. But let's jump into that. So we are going to discuss what we left behind looking back at Star Trek Deep Space Nine. So I think we want to start just with general impressions of what the movie was and how it might have informed or reinformed our perspective about Deep Space Nine at large. Cicero, what was your experience like watching this from beginning to end, and what were some standout moments in it for you?
As I had said to you yesterday, it was, in my eyes, it was better than it had any right to be. And I think there's a thing about documentaries, especially documentaries on subject matters that you really enjoy. If they're done even with a modicum of respect, they really can hit the right spot for you. I thought they did a great job with this one. Some of the standout moments to me was watching them listening to Ira kind of be our guide through where they were at the time and the difficulties they had with a brown lead, and how many brown people they had on the show at any given moment, which I didn't even consciously think of and realize until I saw the doc. And then also, I think the moment that stood out the most to me was when they were taking a moment and going through these checklists, and they were kind of just patting themselves on the back on social justice issues and what have you. And they're in the control room and they're like, women leads, yes. People of color, yes. Whatever the social commentaries were that they, social commentaries, homelessness. We did all of those things. And then same-sex relationships, they checked it, and then they stopped themselves and really kind of talked about how they did things. They were progressive for the time, but they didn't do enough, and they should have done enough. And they talked about very specific moments, particularly Garrick being a gay Cardassian who definitely had a crush on Bashir, mm-hmm. and how they didn't explore those things and how they should have. And like those moments, the fact that the show was as socially conscious as it was, and as bold as it was, even for the time, they realized they could have been even more bold. And I appreciated that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Zaki, what about you? What did you think of the movie overall, and what were some standout moments for you?
It felt like a validation. What I felt, when Deep Space Nine went off the air, even though it was like the top rated syndicated show at the time, it was like it was just not the Star Trek that people talked about, so what the documentary alludes to is very real. Like it's part of the mix, so it's always important because it's in the conversation, but that's not the Star Trek people think of. That's not the one people talk about. So, I've said this, and I always give my brother a hard time because for 20 years, I've been like, Deep Space Nine, that's the one you got to watch. And he has just now, he started watching it so 20 years later, and I remember telling him back in 99, 2000, this is going to be the one. It's going to take a while. People are going to discover it, Mm-hmm. So it's been gratifying, and I'm not like sitting here like, oh, I'm the only one who noticed this, because obviously a lot of people did, and that's kind of my point. Is it was gratifying to be in a crowd, and it was a packed theater, by the way.
Yeah,
and it was a crowd of not just Star Trek fans, but Deep Space Nine fans, mm-hmm. and that was exhilarating to me because it's like a cult within a cult.
Right.
You know that you're dedicated if you turn up for the Deep Space Nine documentary.
Exactly, and they were like laughing at the inside jokes. They're like, "Oh, that's Nog," and and like they're getting it, And so that was great. And so I appreciate the fact that Ira Bear took on this task to give a victory lap to the work that his crew and his cast accomplished. But I'm also like, it tells you something that he had to crowdfund this documentary because CBS couldn't be bothered to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I'm like, if that ain't a perfect metaphor for where Deep Space Nine sits in the firmament, I don't know what is. But by that same token, I think, I think it makes it more precious. It's Deep Space Nine is like the indie punk Star Trek band.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, we kind of love that they didn't sign on to a mainstream label. They're just they were doing their thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And people discovered on their own. I mean, I love it,
Very true. Yeah. And very well said. Rachel, you and I both came to Deep Space Nine embarrassingly late. I've talked about that before.
I'm not embarrassed.
Well, okay. Fair enough, but
I started watching it right after TNG, so
yeah. All right,
like a real fan.
So
in 2008,
that just reinforces my own embarrassment, to be honest, though. So, but either way, you have called Deep Space Nine your favorite of the shows. I mean, well, sometimes TNG edges it out in your mind, but you love Deep Space Nine.
Yeah, I mean, TNG has this like campiness to it that I appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
Deep Space Nine for me is more of a modern show.
Right.
I mean, they certainly lean on that in the
it is in there with like X-Files and stuff as like, a show that I would consider like one of my guys of shows.
Yeah.
And like I don't know what TNG is, but I love TNG, but it is more of like that's more of a campy show.
But DS9's in your top tier.
Yeah, like I think DS9 has more like meaningful stuff in it.
So what was the experience like for you in watching this, and what stood out to you during the documentary?
I enjoyed myself. I was really excited at how crowded our theater was. And
yeah, ours was packed too.
They had moved it from a smaller theater to a bigger theater.
Oh wow!
Yeah, they switched it with a showing of Endgame, I noticed.
Wow!
Oh wow!
Yeah.
That's saying something.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Monday night.
Well, still though, I mean,
yeah.
Hell, Monday night, that's it's even more apparent that people are willing to turn out for Deep Space Nine on a Monday night.
Yeah. So I was like, I didn't know that there were this many other people who like Deep Space Nine. That's really cool. And yeah, I appreciated the documentary a lot. It made me realize how far ahead of its time it was. I watched Deep Space Nine in 2013, and there were things in there that, like, for example, Nog having PTSD and having a limb amputated and then having PTSD. To me, I was just like, oh yeah, that's something you would put in your show, right? Like, of course. And like, I had never even thought about the fact. I was like, they did that in the 90s. Yeah. Like, that was like not part of people's like consciousness.
They did that in peacetime.
Yeah, like that wasn't like a part of life that there are people missing limbs with PTSD around.
Yeah. At least not since Vietnam.
Yeah. So
or the first Gulf War.
Yeah, that like I think just because I watched it so late and it did seem so modern to me that I didn't really realize how early it really was. Mm-hmm. And it really was ahead of its time. And I know that Ira didn't give them a check mark for LGBT issues, but I was thinking the Trill episode that was done in TNG versus the Trill episode, or the Trill, love across the
Lifetimes.
The Lifetimes episode, that Deep Space Nine did, it was so much more progressive. In TNG, the plot is like Beverly is in a romantic relationship with a Trill, and then he dies, and then his symbiont has to go into Riker. And so then she starts having an affair with Riker, but then the Trill goes into a woman, and she's just like, nope.
Right. That's where I draw the line.
Yeah. And doesn't even consider it. It's not even on the table. And I'm just I remember watching that and being like, that seems so unrealistic. I think that if Chris's consciousness was moved into a woman's body, I would at least think about it. I wouldn't be like, nope, sorry.
That's love.
Ew.
Yeah.
That's love, ladies and gentlemen.
I know.
Yeah. So, versus the Deep Space Nine episode where, again, she, it wasn't maybe as well considered as we would have today, but it was still
it was a step forward, but I applauded the self-awareness that they demonstrated.
Yeah, no, I definitely like that. But it's just, I think it just shows that Deep Space Nine really kind of was ahead of its time in a lot of ways. It's just, looking back with modern eyes. Yeah. So I guess if I had one criticism, I would think that, but this is a criticism I have for all of these types of documentaries, is that I think that there was a little bit of mythologizing happening where Ira would say stuff like, well, that's not what the producers wanted or whatever, but that's what the show needed, is serialization. I'm like, you say that now because everybody does it, but at the time, I don't know if that's what you really believe.
But then they poked that by ending the movie with the Garrick quote about what was true.
Yeah,
the lie is true, especially the lie.
Well, let me offer one addition to that is the narrative presented in the film echoes in many ways the narrative in the Star Trek Deep Space Nine companion, which was contemporaneously accounting for the production of the show. So a lot of what there is an air of mythologizing to the extent that it's very much there's a self-congratulatory air. However, they at the time had a lot of the discussions that they now in this documentary talk about retrospectively.
Oh, okay.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never.
Yeah, if you guys ever seriously, that book is out of print now, the Deep Space Nine Companion. It is highly, highly, highly recommended. It puts to shame any other Star Trek companion book that's ever been written.
Excellent. That's
yeah.
I'll have to keep an eye out for it at Half Price Books.
Yeah, I've seen crazier things float across the table at our local Half Price bookstore, but I'll probably just keep a more general eye out for it anyway. Well, as for me, as I've said before, I came to this show embarrassingly late because I was the stupid kid who gave, voice to a lot of the idiotic criticisms that they talk about in the documentary about.
Did you run one of those things they write?
No. No. But I mean, it's not on a spaceship.
A Taylor?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Well, that was the thing. It never occurred to me that I wouldn't like the characters. I honestly don't know what kept me away from the show for so long.
It wasn't on a ship.
That was probably part of it. But then, 2005 happens and Star Trek effectively goes to sleep for several years. And you start to hunger for more. And you naturally go to the things that you haven't seen because it's new to you, right? And so it took a while, but eventually I discovered the greatness of this show. And I think one of the things that I most appreciated about the documentary, it got surprisingly emotional for me, not because there were necessarily experiences that I related to, but putting everything in the proper context for what the show was as it was coming out really did help solidify in my mind why I at least think that Star Trek Deep Space Nine is the best show in the franchise. It is not my favorite show, but I do believe that it is the best one. Armin Shimmerman, he's like, sorry, ours was better. And I had to laugh a little bit at that because I don't think that he's wrong. But particularly the prescient elements that were on display, like the tent cities in the Gabriel Bell episodes. And I also appreciated the context that was given to the significance of the diversity on the show, because since this is the Star Trek universe, when you're a human being, you're just a human being. Like it's not like until Cisco directly mentioned like why he didn't want to go into the holodeck for a fantasized version of the 1960s. They don't really mention the differences that were plaguing that brought up racism in society. You know, they just were people. And hearing Avery Brooks, even though it was archival footage, it's too bad that he didn't shoot new interview footage, but I had never seen the clip where he talked about being human and brown. And particularly also hearing Cicero Holmes talk about that. And also they called out the CNN 90s documentary.
Right.
Because, they mentioned, and, that looking past Star Trek's contributions to 90s TV in general is just idiotic in my mind. But calling out specifically that they never mentioned exactly what Cicero Holmes was talking about and what Ira Bear was talking about just kind of made me go, yes, that's exactly right. Because I remember thinking very similarly along those lines when I was watching that series.
I can vouch for Chris that he did mention it while he was watching that.
Yeah.
It was like they mentioned Star Trek, and then they did like a whole segment of like black TV shows. And I remember you mentioning it. Like, what about Deep Space Nine?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, just because, and granted, it's not like the show's material itself dealt with race, but there was representation that the show was not getting credit for, which just drove me nuts. So having that context kind of explained to me more explicitly in the documentary was very powerful. And it just goes to show how special that show is. And then you get into the broader issues surrounding terrorism and how Kira was rather unrepentant whenever she was confronted with something that she did as a part of the resistance to the Cardassian occupation. And yeah, they probably couldn't have gotten away with that kind of stuff if the show was made even just a few years later. So, I'm sorry. Did you say something, Cicero?
No, I just agreed with you.
Oh, okay. Well,
the church said amen.
But yeah, I mean, all of those things were so potent, and Rachel already talked about Nog's PTSD. I mean, the Dominion War created a series of really potent stories, and Rachel mentioned TNG having an element of camp to it. And I can't disagree with that when you look at the content and the tone of the episodes that dealt with the war. And even with, what constitutes religious extremism and terrorism, because DS9 was dealing with that. I'm sure that it was inspired by things that were still actively happening in the Middle East at the time, but we're obviously much more hyper aware of those things now. And the idea of a fundamentalist Bajoran blowing up a school because they disagree with the lessons being taught there, that seems ahead of its time to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I want to comment on two things. The first is, it was unfortunate that we didn't get any new footage from Avery Brooks, but I love the fact that every time he referred to himself as a brown person, and when he did that, it made me think of you, Zaki, because you referred to. As we talked about Deep Space Nine, the fact that you referred to him as a brown person, and maybe it was because in Captains he also referred to himself as a brown person or something like that. I don't know if that correlation was there.
That's a thing that I read an interview with him where he referred to himself as brown, and I found that so incredibly profound at a very early age that I adopted that into my own vernacular. when discussing myself, and I think it betrays an awareness that's he's like a celestial being, Avery Brooks.
A celestial jazz musician, maybe.
Really, because and to me, the level of profundity that he displayed in interviews and things, really, like, it's like this is a guy who was marching to his own beat, and it took a while for people to catch up.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Avery Brooks, and we kind of talked about pre-show, and I don't know if I'm stepping on toes, Chris. I might be, but Avery Brooks is an actor. They talked, they spotlighted the fact that he had previously been, right before this show, right before DS9, he had been on the show, his own show called Hawk, which was a spinoff from a show that he was on called Spencer for Hire, where he was the sidekick to the white guy. But his presence was so, I don't want to say imposing, but it always made people take notice. And there's just something, I've always really loved Avery Brooks. Watching Spencer for Hire, it was always exciting for me to watch television and to see a positive Black person on the TV screen. So if that was happening, that was something that I was paying attention to. So Spencer for Hire came out, Hawk was there. Hawk was that guy. He had his own show. I paid attention to that. In fact, I named my cats. When I got new cats, I named them Spencer and Hawk.
Nice.
But so it was important to me to have him on the screen. But over the course of his career, there was one thing that remained constant. His presence on screen, whether it be in DS9 or whether it be in one of my favorite films of all time, The Very Terrible, The Big Hit, he's
in that.
Yes.
Oh my God, I forgot about that.
He is so regal and majestic. Even that movie is the silliest movie of all time. It makes no sense, but his presence is so great during that film that it brings it all together, and to hear him speak was a great thing. So that was the one thing. The other thing was that even during those times, even in the 90s, people weren't necessarily thinking about Middle Eastern terrorism in the 90s.
Right.
When people thought about, they thought about terrorism, terrorism came from two places. It came from the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who were fighting against the Israelis for land in Palestine. But the more pressing group, the group that seemed closer to home, especially here domestically, was the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. And they were, the PLO was attacking Israelis, and as a New Yorker, everyone has family in Israel, because in New York is a high Jewish population, but the IRA hit places in Ireland and Scotland and in England, and so that touched America very, very specifically. And made them a threat, not necessarily domestically, but when you thought about terrorism, at least in the 80s, and, the plane that was shot down over Lockerbie, Scotland, a lot of people thought was the IRA. The IRA terrorism then wasn't this racial dog whistle that it is today. It's, it really kind of brought to mind these guys specifically. But they were a real enough threat, but they were benign enough, at least domestically, that you could talk about one of your protagonists being a terrorist, being a freedom fighter, and not have it be a thing that immediately meant that person couldn't be a morally true or like chaotic good, to borrow a D&D phrase.
Well, when I was a kid, like in the late 90s or so, mid to late 90s, when I thought of terrorists, the first person I thought of back then was Gary Oldman, because my parents made the mistake of taking me to see Air Force One in the theater.
Sure.
Sure. And that was in the 90s. So, but no, I mean, that's a really good point. I mean, the larger public perception had not been altered by what would happen at the turn of the century. Right. And but I mean, it just goes back to show how ahead of its time Deep Space Nine really was in dealing with these issues that would become front and center in the global discourse in the next decade. And I mean, that's one of the things that I just am continually fascinated by, that the show, it didn't seek to comment on things that were happening in the world. It was trying to talk about things that could potentially be universal to the human condition. And now it's far more relevant than it ever was while it was on the air. And
I mean, it had a whole episode about, like, what are you willing to do if it's immoral to be, like, safe?
Yeah.
Right? And, like, that is, like...
I can live with it.
Yeah, but that was in the 90s.
Yeah.
Before that became, like, a fundamental, like, question of the next decade of, like, well, what sort of morally dubious things are you willing to do to be safe?
Do you want values or do you want stability?
Yeah, and, you know, the U.S. chose stability. We have no values anymore. So, like, I guess it was prescient in that way too.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. But I mean, it just, and I think that the documentary does a really good job of making the case for why Deep Space Nine ends up not just being special in terms of the scope of the Star Trek franchise itself, but in the stories that it was telling far before these stories would become even more relevant. But yeah, pretty astonishing. Another thing that I certainly wanted to ask you guys about is we got a pretty unique opportunity to look at what could or might be with the breaking in a writer's room of a season 8 premiere. And Zaki, how did that strike you? The story that they thought that they, you know, that they were basically trying to create in a way that they could shoot it if they wanted to. 20 years hence, picking things up with pretty much every character. What did you think of that story?
I mean, it was really compelling, and it was just fun to watch the people who made the thing essentially create their own fanfic.
Right.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, the only downside is that it ends with "to be continued," and it never will be. I mean, it's all build up and no payoff, unfortunately. But I think that the fact that 20 years later they're still so engaged, they're still so. I mean, I have such respect for all these people, you know, and again, this goes to a little bit from having just devoured that companion book. You get a sense throughout there just how much these people adored this show that they were working on.
Well, I'm glad that you said that, because Rachel and I were talking about this on the drive home last night from watching this movie. And we were talking about, you know, breaking the story. I mean, I legitimately teared up in a couple of places. And then we sort of got to talking about not just stuff that had been laid out in the movie, but also the current state of the Star Trek franchise.
Sure.
We have an infrastructure right now that conceivably is very hungry for new material in this franchise. Why couldn't this happen exactly? If there was enough will on the side of CBS All Access and enough money put aside to reconstruct the relevant sets and to bring everybody into the fold, why couldn't this happen? Rachel said that she just doesn't think that it could ever happen. What did you say? You didn't think the actors could be?
I don't think you can convince the actors. I don't think you can convince the writers to actually write a whole season.
Really?
Yeah, because they were doing that for fun. I think if you're like, yeah, you gotta do 10 episodes.
Right. They even said so, you know?
Yeah, they talked about how the actors talked about how hard it was shooting it, the makeup, all of it. It was hard work. I don't know if they want to do it again. Some of them probably would.
Well, I mean, makeup technology has certainly advanced a lot in 20 years. Discovery is proof of that.
Yeah, well, to put them all in like full face.
Right.
I mean,
makeup that they can't act through.
Here's my sticking. Well, but that's it. Like we watch. There's a pretty cool featurette on the Discovery Season 1 Blu-ray about how the new kind of, I guess it was a kind of latex or rubber that they put on for the Klingon makeup can actually move with an actor's performance. I don't know how much more comfortable it might be, but it's certainly there. But that's the thing. Like, that's my sticking point, I guess, is that we're potentially on the cusp of another CBS Paramount merger. They say that they want to expand the franchise potentially into directions that it has never gone into before and make it more ubiquitous than it's been over the last several years. If if there's packed theaters all across the country, and obviously I don't know that, but if there were for this documentary, for this show, there's certainly a lot of goodwill out there for Deep Space Nine. I mean, Alexander Siddig even said it just took them 20 years to get here in liking the show.
Yeah, but maybe we don't have to revive and reboot everything from the 90s.
Yeah, I'm reminded of what does the Vision say in Age of Ultron? A thing isn't beautiful because it lasts. I think Deep Space Nine is this beautiful little thing that now exists under glass. I don't know that I want them to disturb that. There's something to the fact that the final shot that we ever got of that station was as it just receded into the distance, and we just heard the mournful tones of that music for the last time. I think there's meaning in that. There's value in that.
Do you think
that's kind of where I'm at?
Do you think that meaning would be undercut even if there was a limited expansion of the material?
I mean, I fully expect that if these people were involved, it would be something impressive. However, I mean, time moves in one direction, and we're 20 years past the last time these people embodied their characters. And, I mean, it's, do we want to see, do we want to see people struggling? Do we want to see Rene Auberjonois trying to struggle through wearing that makeup? I mean, it's like, to me, it's like, well, there may have been a window, but I feel like, again, it's 20 years. I mean, I think that
Zaki,
window may have closed.
Zaki,
yeah,
it's not linear.
Well, I mean, one thing I will say is Avery Brooks, our celestial being, does not look like he's aged at all. So
yes,
there is that.
Well, and that's the thing.
It could be 20 years. Could be.
I feel like he would be the hardest one to convince. Honestly.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I mean,
yeah.
Because he just, like you said, he marches to the beat of his own drum, and as much as I really would hope to see Sisko again and to fulfill that promise that he made to Cassidy in the very last episode, I mean, I don't have any delusions about the fact that this is probably like 99% not going to happen. But if it were going to, I think this is the climate in which it could, if that makes sense.
I agree with that. I agree. And look, I mean, I think Ira Bear knows what he's doing. I mean, I think he put that out there as even if it's not at the forefront of his thinking, it's got to be there, a little piece of him that's like, hey, let's put this out there and see what CBS says. I can't imagine that hasn't occurred to him.
Hey guys. Yeah. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, the animated series.
Yeah, I
certainly wouldn't be against pretty much any experience.
Yeah, so when you pose the question, Chris, my immediate knee jerk reaction was the same as Rachel and Zaki's, which is like, while in my head that is something that I want, I don't know if my eyes can stand it, and nor do I think that there would be enough engagement from the people that we'd want in order to make it a thing that we can absorb in a real way. Because again, as they said in the doc, 14-hour days on the low end, usually 16 to 18-hour days were what they were dealing with. And again, this was 20 years ago for these guys. Everybody on that show, everyone associated with the show, especially the talent, is 20 years older than they were then. And they're not going to be able to do the types of things for the length of time that they had to do them then.
I don't disagree with that. I really don't. But the thing that is weird is that in my mind, it seems more plausible that they would bring Deep Space Nine back for an 8th season, more so than it is that they would remaster the show.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Which is ludicrous to me. But for some reason, it just feels more plausible that they would actually create new material as opposed to. But I mean, oh man, let's talk about that for a second.
Yeah. Oh, and while we're talking about that, I just want to ask: in your theater, guys, did the cut seem weird? Like, were words cut off at the bottom of the screen?
Sometimes during scene transitions, there were like these little orange cubes that would show up that looked like an artifact of the stream.
Yeah, mine. Yeah, I think this is the format. Maybe it was just the screen that we were on. The formatting was bad, where there was, probably one like 20th of the screen was cut off at the bottom. So like I was missing the bottom halves of words sometimes, and there was a little bit that was missing, but outside of.
How many people were in your theater? I don't think I heard you say.
Yeah, mine was probably about a third to 40% full. It wasn't bad. It was definitely more than I expected to be in that theater. And I live in euphemistically, I'll call this place the suburbs of Chicago.
The outskirts of the
yeah. There are no sidewalks here, so I call this the boonies, but they call it the suburbs. So, I will say that this area was probably, not necessarily. Well, I'm definitely grateful that it was in the area. I don't know if it was necessarily one of the key markets that they were looking to have a theater be full in. So. I was surprised at the number of people in this area that were there.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that a bunch of people showed up for it.
Right.
Well, considering what we know about the remastering process that was in play for the next generation, where they effectively scanned all the footage they could get their hands on and reassembled every episode from the individual elements and re-edited everything together, effectively remaking the show. It's not just plugging in finished episodes. They had to go through a rather painstaking process. It just doesn't seem like they're willing to do that for Deep Space Nine, but my God, this footage that we saw that they did take the time and effort to scan in at high definition resolutions. Zaki, what did you think of seeing Deep Space Nine in this kind of clarity that we never had before?
Oh, it's beautiful. I mean, it's a shame. I was having that thought as I was watching. I was like, well, enjoy this because it's all you're going to get,
Right.
But it just goes to what we said earlier and what this whole documentary is built on. It's like CBS/Paramount. I mean, they never truly valued this show, so it stands to reason. I mean, when you think about it, I get it. Obviously, it's going to be a significant expense. Plus, next generation Blu-rays didn't move to the volume that would justify doing it for like the lesser shows. I get it, but you wonder, like, Star Trek is an annuity, right? It's always. Like it's going to be, it has the benefit of, unlike many other brands or franchises, where there's always going to be value because of the word Star and Trek next to each other in the title. So it's one of those things where you're like, well, if you guys would spend the money on it, you'll earn the dividends on it for decades to come.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody in the food chain is going to make that kind of decision, because those dividends are not going to come in on their watch. They'll come in potentially long after they've left the company, so it's one of these situations we're just stuck with, like the show, and it looks like fine for what it is, but it could look so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, what did you think of seeing those scenes of Deep Space Nine in that level of clarity?
I think it looked real good. I don't know, like, I didn't know. I'm not the kind of person who notices these things.
You didn't notice that?
I looked at it, I was like, looks good. I probably, while I'm watching it normally, I'm usually like, this doesn't look very good in the back of my head all the time.
Oh, good Lord.
So, like, it just looked normal.
But it looked extra good.
Yeah. I looked at battle sequence, that looked fantastic.
Yeah, they did a really nice job, and that's,
I did notice that one.
That's it. Well, that's also one of the things that would make remastering Deep Space Nine more difficult, because by that point, later in the series, when they had transitioned away from doing model shots and into, for what at the time was pretty decent CG sequences. Those aren't things that can be upscaled in a traditional way. They would have to redo those visual effects shots. So particularly by the end of Deep Space Nine's run, it would be far more expensive to remaster Deep Space Nine by actually doing those VFX shots again. And it just makes me sad thinking about it, basically. Because, if any show deserves that kind of a look. But I think, Zaki, you're absolutely right in the sense that when they do the remasterings of the shows, they're not just doing them for physical media releases. I mean, this is the way that modern television networks operate and streaming services operate. How many people would sign up for CBS All Access if they put out a news release saying, see DS9 in HD here first?
Yep.
I wonder.
Yeah, I think that's a chicken and an egg proposition. I think it would have to be, we would have to see the preponderance of, or the results of all of the Star Trek shows that they're deciding to push out, increase the viewership and the membership of Star Trek. CBS All Access, before they would go through the expense of remastering DS9. I don't think it would happen first. I think it would happen after.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's more plausible for a season 8 than remastering the show that already exists. But hey.
Be careful what you wish for, Chris. The X-Files seasons that they made recently, those were bad.
Yeah. You did. Friends looked okay. It was a much simpler show. The Blu-rays for Friends. You got the Blu-rays for Friends.
No, that wasn't a No, I'm talking about doing a season 8.
Yeah. Oh.
Also, I don't want more Friends. No.
I don't need any more. I've got enough Friends.
There's plenty there.
Bajillion episodes that they made is plenty.
Fair enough. Well, let's wind this down a little bit. I guess just kind of final thoughts on the movie. Where did it move the needle at all in your appreciation of Deep Space Nine? Cicero, start us off.
I want to say a couple of things. The first is there's one portion of this documentary that they didn't gloss over. I mean, they leaned headfirst into it, but it can't be understated, and that is the presence of people that look like me, that sounded like me. The fact that the only familial relationship in Star Trek history that really, really existed was on DS9 between a black dad and his black son. And that, or as Avery Brooks would say, and more appropriately should say, a brown dad and his brown son. And the fact that there were so many brown people on there that his, and obviously in the 90s, you weren't going to have, a widowed black man who then winds up falling in love with some white woman. So of course his next love interest was going to be brown as well. But you saw a nuclear family in space, and that can't be, and then you saw his dad, and you saw all of those things. All of those things were there, and that just can't be understated. And the impact that it had on me, and I'm sure lots of people that looked like me, can't be understated. And if for no other reason, this show means a lot to me. But on top of that, it was excellent. It was excellent in a way that the other shows weren't bold enough to be. And in a lot of ways, if I can kind of encapsulate what DS9 was to me, it was hip hop. DS9 is hip hop. DS9 went out and said, "Oh, hey, we see what you guys are doing over here, but we're going to do that thing, but we're going to do it a little bit different." And people said, "But no, you can't do that." And they said, "No, you know what? That's all right. We're still going to do it that way. Check this out. Oh, but wait a minute. You can't do this thing. You can't talk about those things. But you know what? That's our reality. That's the reality of the people that are, that are watching our show. So that's what we're going to talk about. And that's, we're going to bring those issues to light. Oh, but wait a minute. The two women can't kiss on the, what do you mean? Two women kiss in real life? What are you talking about? We're going to do that. That's what we're going to do. And, and that's hip hop. That's, goes out there and it punches society, and it punches like the societal norms in the mouth. And it says, look, pay attention to me. All of this nice stuff that you guys are talking about over there, that's not the reality. That's not the reality of the world that we live in. So now you're going to hear about our world and how we do things and what's going on, and you're going to pay attention. And they did a phenomenal job doing that. DS9 is hip hop.
Very well said. And there's something else that I wanted to bring up that you just kind of reminded me of when they talk about Avery Brooks's hair.
Yes.
And how they were afraid to let him wear what was familiar to him and to other people who knew his work. I don't even know if you could call it subtle racism that's inherent in something like that. I certainly didn't see Sisko's look later on when he was more familiar as threatening at all. I mean, Sisko, I think a lot of that is done in wardrobe, right? I mean, Hawk's wardrobe was very different from Captain Sisko's wardrobe from what it looks like. And Hawk just kind of had a more threatening countenance because that's who that was.
Right. But the thing about that is that the bald head on a black man is a choice, and it's a choice that can be perceived as aggressive, has been perceived as aggressive, has been perceived as, and there still, I think there's nothing worse than an aggressive black man. Not even an angry black man, because an angry black man can be controlled, an angry black man can be put down, but an aggressive one is dangerous because you're not exactly sure what he's going to do. And that scares you more than someone who is out of control, because you don't know if you have justification for putting down an aggressive black man. You have justification for putting down an angry one. And that was part of it. It's just like my choices about what I want to do with my hairstyle, what makes me feel comfortable. And you telling me no was just another way to geld a black man on television to conform to these norms in order to make it palatable for the quote unquote masses.
And he won out. Eventually,
and was proven right.
Yeah, absolutely. Zaki, final thoughts on what this movie, how it encapsulates Deep Space Nine for you, if it encapsulates Deep Space Nine for you, and if it I mean, you already appreciate the show so much. Does it move the needle at all for you in that respect?
I mean, it makes me excited to resume my rewatch. I think it touches on excuse me, it touches on the surface, and I don't know how it's going to play to people who are inclined to dislike the show. I'm genuinely curious. But for those who already like it, it's an affirmation. And I mentioned at the outset that my brother has just started watching the show really for the first time, since it first came on. And so he keeps me posted. He'll be like, "Oh, I'm about to watch this one." And so he was about to watch Duet. And I was like, buckle up, because you're about to watch one of the greatest Star Trek episodes ever made. And he's like, "Oh, you sure you want to say that?" Like get my expectations up. I was like, "No, you're about to watch one of the best Star Treks ever made." And then he watches it and he calls me. He's like, "Whoa." Right. And that's, I think Deep Space Nine created a space for, sorry, no pun intended, a space for itself that was uniquely suited to those types of stories that were not just about exploring the final frontier. They were really about exploring the darker and kind of more uncomfortable parts of ourselves. And I love that this franchise, I mean, one thing I've said to you guys so much whenever we have these conversations is like, Star Trek is like ice cream. Everybody can have their flavor. Well, it's like, I love that this is a flavor that not everybody's going to dig, but the people who dig it, they really dig it.
Very well said. Excellent. Rachel, what do you think of this movie overall? Does it move the needle for you in appreciating a show that you already appreciate a lot?
I wouldn't say it moved the needle, but it did make me want to revisit it.
Okay.
So I would say you should watch it if you like Deep Space Nine, because it'll remind you of why you liked something that you liked, which is a really nice, warm, fuzzy feeling inside. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't seen Deep Space Nine, I think it gives you a good flavor of what the show was about and would probably make you appreciate it more when you do watch it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right. As for me, I think the thing that I'm glad to have absorbed after watching this movie is just getting greater context for what the show meant in its own time. Obviously, it was underappreciated in its own time, but seeing and listening to sort of those direct reactions and what it was doing by disrupting things in its own time does give me a greater appreciation for it that I did not have a couple of days ago. And I consider myself someone who appreciates Deep Space Nine quite a lot. So I give this movie a very hearty recommendation. I think we all do to varying degrees, and can't wait to see what this leads to, if anything. I mean, maybe this will lead to nothing, but if two theaters were pretty much full between the four of us, so three of us observe very full theaters, who knows what it could lead to, at least as far as the appreciation of Deep Space Nine is concerned.
Hope there are always possibilities.
I don't think that there's anything more I can say after that. That's very well said. Well, all right, everybody, that's going to do it for episode number 42 of Discovery Debrief. We hope you enjoyed the show, and if you did, please like and follow us on our social media channels. And if you'd be so kind, we'd also appreciate it if you were to review for the show on iTunes or Facebook. It only takes a minute, and we'll be happy to read your review on the air when it's posted. If you have any questions, you can follow the show on Twitter at DSC Debrief, where you can also find all of our individual Twitter handles. And feel free to send us questions through Twitter, our Facebook like page, or by emailing us directly at hailingfrequencies@discoverydebrief.com. Please be sure to set your courses for this feed for future episodes, and be sure to join us as we convene next time, I think to talk about Avengers Endgame. But
heck yeah.
It could be anything considering what we can get to. So as long as you continue to enjoy listening to this show, then we're going to continue to enjoy making it. But as always, until we meet again, please go boldly, my friends.